Have you ever noticed how silence speaks louder than words? How one day, without a message, a call, or a reply can make someone stop, think, and feel in ways they never expected? Today, I want to take you inside the mind of someone who realizes, too late perhaps, the weight of your absence, and how that silence can change everything. There is a silence that speaks louder than words. The moment you stop responding, the moment you pull back, it is felt immediately. Even the most confident person will pause and notice, and in that pause, the mind begins to wander, to replay moments, to analyze what just happened. On the first day, confusion is the first emotion he feels, but it is not harsh or accusatory at first. It is subtle, a quiet awareness that something has shifted. He wonders, did I do something wrong? Was there something in my words, in my tone, in my behavior that pushed her away? That curiosity is not a weakness. It is the human mind trying to make sense of the unexpected, the unfamiliar. Imagine a man receiving a message he expects to be answered promptly, a message that is casual, maybe even playful. Perhaps it is a joke or a question or a simple, "Hey, how are you?" But the reply never comes. In that moment, he does not just wait, he observes, he retraces steps, he questions himself. It is not about manipulation, it is about reflection. He searches his memory, reviewing every conversation, every shared laugh, every misunderstanding, looking for a clue. Humans are wired to notice absence. Neuroscientific studies show that when a message or response is delayed, the brain's prefrontal cortex becomes highly active. It begins analyzing and predicting outcomes, replaying interactions, and trying to understand why the expected connection is missing. Even a short silence triggers curiosity and attention because the mind cannot simply ignore it. Day one is also a time when the imagination begins to stir. He might imagine different scenarios, harmless or unsettling. Perhaps he thinks maybe she is busy, maybe she is tired, maybe she just forgot. Or maybe the mind wanders into uncertainty thinking, did I overstep? Did I say something wrong? He starts noticing little things he had overlooked before. The way she smiles, the way she talks, the care she shows in small gestures, and it all comes into sharper focus because suddenly it is contrasted with absence. Absence is not empty. It is full of questions, and it asks the quiet question, what have you been taking for granted? Confusion on the first day is not a passive state. It is an active process of observation. He starts to notice patterns he had ignored, moments he had dismissed, and behaviors he had considered normal. You become a mirror, not by confrontation, not by argument, but by stepping back. He begins seeing himself in relation to you, seeing how his actions and words affect the world around him. In psychology, this is called self-referential processing. When we notice the absence of something we value, our minds begin analyzing the past and present interactions more deeply, often with surprising clarity. Real-life examples show how powerful this first day can be. I knew someone who had always been quick to text back, quick to respond, quick to demand attention in small ways without even realizing it. One day, the person he cared about stopped replying immediately, stopped engaging with his constant check-ins. Within hours, he began to notice the way he had been behaving. He replayed his own words in his mind. He questioned his tone, his timing, and his assumptions about their relationship. He did not feel anger at first. He did not feel resentment. He felt curiosity, a longing to understand why the connection had changed, why the expected warmth was missing. This curiosity is a gift. It is not always comfortable, but it is a space where growth begins. On that first day, he is forced to step outside himself, to notice how his presence, or perhaps his over-presence, has affected someone else. Humans rarely pause to observe their own patterns. We move through life reacting, responding, chasing what we want, often unaware of the impact we have on others. Silence, in its subtle way, forces observation. It forces thoughtfulness. It forces the realization that words and actions carry weight, that relationships are delicate ecosystems, and that respect and attention are not automatic, they are earned and reciprocated. Curiosity is also emotional. He feels it not just in his mind, but in his body. There is a tension in the chest, a restlessness that he cannot ignore. This is natural because humans are social creatures. We rely on connection for emotional stability. When the connection is unexpectedly paused, the nervous system registers it. Heart rates fluctuate slightly, attention sharpens, and the mind begins rehearsing scenarios to resolve the discomfort. This is not manipulation, not a power play. It is a reflection of how deeply we care, how deeply we notice when something important is missing. On the first day, confusion and curiosity are intertwined. He is confused because the world he expected, the world where messages are returned, laughter is shared, presence is constant, has shifted. He is curious because the absence is meaningful. It is as if silence itself has created a space for introspection. In many ways, silence on day one is an invisible teacher. It teaches awareness, patience, observation, and subtle understanding without saying a word. Consider the subtle changes that happen in his behavior on this first day. Perhaps he double-checks his messages before sending them. Perhaps he rereads his own words, wondering if the tone was right. Perhaps he refrains from sending another text too soon, learning unconsciously that eagerness can be misinterpreted. The curiosity created by silence leads him to consider not only your feelings but also the way he expresses himself, the energy he brings into interactions, and the respect he shows for your time and space. This is why the first day of silence can be so transformative, not just for him but for the dynamic between you. It is not about punishment. It is about awareness. In that confusion, in that curiosity, he begins to see the value of your presence in a new light. And sometimes, the mind needs just this one day to realize how much something matters. The first day is not about change yet. It is about perception. He begins noticing, reflecting, and becoming aware. And awareness, even in the smallest doses, is the first step toward understanding, respect, and growth. In essence, day one of silence is a mirror held up to his mind and heart. It does not yell, it does not demand, it simply exists. And in that quiet, subtle presence of absence, he is forced to look inward. The mind starts to question, the heart starts to feel, and the connection, even in its paused state, begins to communicate more powerfully than words ever could. By the end of the first day, confusion begins to soften into deeper curiosity. He may start recalling moments of laughter, gestures of kindness, shared experiences that previously seemed ordinary, but now feel precious. He begins to remember not just what you did, but what you meant. And in that space, the seed of reflection is planted, a seed that, over time, can grow into understanding, change, and renewed respect. Even in the simplest terms, the first day of silence is potent. It interrupts routine. It invites awareness. It sparks curiosity. And it teaches, in its quiet, unobtrusive way, the value of presence, attention, and care. Day one is the moment when he begins to see that absence is not emptiness. It is a message, a subtle call to notice, to reflect, and to understand. It is the beginning of a journey, one that moves from confusion through curiosity and towards something deeper, something more meaningful, something that can only be experienced in the quiet space you've created. By the second day of your silence, the initial confusion begins to shift. It no longer feels like a small pause or an unusual delay. Now, doubt starts to creep in quietly at first, like a shadow moving across a familiar room. He begins to question himself in ways he rarely allows. Did I do something wrong? The mind asks, but soon it spirals further. Was I too harsh? Did I say something I shouldn't have? Did I take her for granted? These questions echo, not because he seeks punishment, but because absence creates space for reflection, a space that conversation often crowds out. Silence, in this way, becomes a mirror. It reflects his actions, his words, and the impact they have had. Doubt on the second day is more emotional than the curiosity of the first. It begins to inhabit the heart, bringing a quiet tension that is unmistakable. He may find himself revisiting small moments, times when he spoke too quickly, laughed too loudly, or assumed she would always respond with patience. Even seemingly minor gestures, once overlooked, now take on weight. A study on emotional intelligence shows that when people experience sudden distance in relationships, they often begin evaluating not only others' behaviors but their own, searching for meaning, responsibility, and a path toward reconciliation. Your silence, then, is not a punishment, it is a prompt. It encourages awareness and accountability in a way that direct confrontation rarely can. Imagine a man who has grown accustomed to constant connection, to predictable responses, to a sense of ease that comes from familiarity. Suddenly, the text, the call, the laugh, the acknowledgement, everything he took for granted is absent. He begins questioning his role in that absence. Did he dominate conversations? Did he fail to listen? Did he assume, in subtle ways, that his needs, his time, and his energy were more important than hers? These are not easy questions to answer, and yet, silence forces him to confront them. On the second day, doubt often carries a dual nature. It is both unsettling and illuminating. He feels discomfort, yes, because he realizes the connection he relied upon is now contingent upon more than his desires. At the same time, doubt sparks self-reflection. He begins noticing patterns he had previously ignored. Perhaps he had been reactive, impulsive, or careless in communication. Perhaps he had unconsciously imposed his expectations, assuming they were aligned with hers. The pause you create forces him to see himself honestly, without excuses, without immediate answers, without the distraction of ongoing conversation. A real-life example illustrates this clearly. I knew a man who was used to a relationship where he dictated the pace, where his whims often guided the day-to-day interactions. One day, the woman he was involved with stopped responding immediately, stopped showing her usual warmth. At first, he felt confusion, but by the second day, doubt took root. He began to replay his actions, noticing where he had been impatient, where he had interrupted, where he had overlooked her feelings. That doubt was uncomfortable, yes, but it was also transformative. It gave him a chance to see himself through her absence, to notice how he had contributed to the tension, and to recognize the value of her presence in a way he never had before. Doubt on the second day is rarely passive. It occupies the mind fully, subtly reshaping the way he interprets his own behaviors. He may notice his own assumptions, the ways he expected responses, the ways he took connection for granted. This self-reflection is not about blame, it is about understanding. He begins to see that relationships are delicate, that presence is earned, and that communication is not simply about talking, it is about listening, observing, and caring. Emotionally, doubt creates vulnerability. He feels exposed, unsettled, and uncertain. The familiar security he once felt is gone, replaced by a tension that demands attention. He may even catch himself imagining conversations he wishes he had handled differently, apologies he wishes he had offered, gestures he wishes he had made. This is not manipulation. This is the natural unfolding of awareness when someone we value steps back. The silence you create is not a weapon, it is a catalyst for growth. Research on human attachment patterns reinforces this. Studies show that when people experience temporary distance in close relationships, they often engage in deeper introspection, evaluating their own behavior, communication styles, and emotional responses. They start to recognize what they have taken for granted, what they have neglected, and what they might do differently to honor the relationship. Your silence, in this way, is a tool of reflection. It allows him to step outside himself and examine the impact of his actions on someone he values. Doubt is also cumulative. By the second day, it may begin to touch multiple aspects of his life. Perhaps he recalls arguments where he was defensive, moments when he was impatient, or times when he assumed she would always be there regardless of his attitude. These recollections, fueled by doubt, are not merely about the relationship, they are about his own character, his ability to empathize, to respect, to grow. Your absence, though silent, becomes a quiet guide, pointing out areas that require attention, humility, and care. There is a subtle beauty in this second day. Doubt is uncomfortable, yes, but it is honest. It strips away pretense and forces him to confront reality. He can no longer assume that everything is as it seems. He can no longer ignore the consequences of his actions or words. And in this honesty, there is potential for change. Even a single day of genuine self-reflection can shift perspectives, alter behavior, and inspire a deeper appreciation for connection. In practical terms, he may begin changing small habits on the second day. Perhaps he revisits old messages before sending new ones, considering tone and timing. Perhaps he begins to notice patterns in his behavior that previously went unexamined, like interrupting when she speaks or overlooking her preferences. Perhaps he starts to imagine ways to show respect and consideration that he hadn't considered before. These are subtle shifts, often unconscious at first, but they emerge from the space you have created with your silence. Emotionally, the second day of doubt is about awakening. He begins to recognize that the connection he valued is not automatic, that it requires attention, understanding, and care. He begins to see that his previous assumptions were limited, that he had overlooked the importance of listening, of patience, and of empathy. Your silence forces him to notice these gaps, to confront them, and to begin considering how he might fill them, not because he is forced, but because he wants to. Doubt on the second day is also about vulnerability. He begins to realize that relationships are not just about presence, but about emotional investment, awareness, and mutual respect. He feels the absence not as emptiness, but as a signal that something important is at stake. This realization is often the precursor to meaningful change. When we confront our own shortcomings in a calm, reflective space, we are more likely to take responsibility and act with intention. On this day, reflection deepens. He may start imagining conversations where he responds differently, gestures that show care, or actions that demonstrate respect. He begins to see the difference between assuming connection and actively nurturing it. Your silence, therefore, is not simply a pause, it is a catalyst. It encourages him to grow, to adapt, and to recognize the true value of what has been placed in his life. By the end of the second day, doubt and self-reflection have intertwined to create a powerful emotional shift. He is no longer merely curious, he is self-aware. He begins to notice patterns, acknowledge mistakes, and consider what it means to be present not just physically but emotionally. Your absence, subtle and silent, becomes an invitation for him to see himself clearly, to understand his impact, and to recognize the worth of the connection he risks losing. Doubt on the second day is not destructive. It is a necessary discomfort, a mirror reflecting his actions, a challenge to rise above complacency. It is the quiet teacher of responsibility, empathy, and understanding. And through this process, he begins to realize that connection is not a given. It is earned, nurtured, and respected. Even in the simplest moments, like rereading messages, replaying conversations, or noticing gestures he once overlooked, he begins to see the difference between taking someone for granted and valuing their presence. He begins to understand that words alone are insufficient without awareness, patience, and care. Your silence then becomes a profound tool, not for punishment, but for transformation. It creates space for reflection, growth, and self-awareness. By the end of the second day, he begins to see that his doubts are not just about your silence, they are about himself, about his behavior, about his ability to respect, nurture, and honor a connection that matters. Your quiet absence has sparked an inner dialogue, one that is honest, challenging, and ultimately transformative. Doubt has become the lens through which he examines not just the relationship, but his own character, his values, and his capacity for growth. And in that reflection, he begins to understand the power of your silence, the weight of absence, and the clarity that comes when presence is no longer taken for granted. It is uncomfortable, yes, but it is necessary. It is the first step toward genuine self-awareness, accountability, and the possibility of meaningful change. By the third day of your silence, the initial confusion and doubt have transformed into something deeper, something heavier. Anxiety begins to settle in, quiet at first, like a low hum that you can feel in the chest, a restlessness that you cannot quite explain. He begins imagining scenarios running through possibilities both real and imagined, trying to understand what your absence means, what it signals, and what it might cost him. This anxiety is not superficial. It is rooted in the awareness that something significant has shifted. When a connection that once felt constant suddenly pauses, the mind, in its natural instinct, begins to search for resolution, for understanding, for control. He begins asking himself questions, some simple, some difficult. Is she upset with me? Did I overstep? What could I have done differently? The questions are relentless, not because he seeks to manipulate, but because the mind craves clarity. It cannot rest in uncertainty. Humans are wired to seek patterns, to find answers, to reduce ambiguity. When the signals of connection vanish, the brain activates areas associated with problem solving and self-reflection, often creating heightened awareness of actions, words, and their consequences. Anxiety, in this sense, is a natural response. It is the body and mind attempting to process absence, attempting to understand what has been lost and what might still be regained. The third day also brings a flood of memories. He recalls moments that once seemed ordinary, the way you laughed at a joke he barely remembered, the way you noticed small details about him, the way your presence made the room feel lighter. Now, in the silence, these memories are vivid, amplified by the stark contrast between presence and absence. He begins to feel the weight of what he took for granted. This is the subtle power of your silence. It does not scream or demand attention. It simply allows him to see what he once overlooked, to notice the value of your presence, and to confront the impact of his absence in your life. On this day, anxiety often transforms into realization. He starts connecting the dots between his behavior and your reaction. Perhaps he notices times when he was dismissive, when he assumed things would always go his way, when he failed to consider your perspective. He begins to recognize patterns he had ignored, assumptions he had made, and moments he had taken lightly. This realization is not punitive, it is enlightening. It allows him to see the relationship and himself through a lens of honesty, stripped of excuses and illusions. A real life example makes this clear. A friend once shared how her partner, who had often been self-absorbed, began to truly understand her value when she stepped back for a few days. On the third day, he became anxious, not in a manipulative sense, but with a quiet, growing awareness that his previous behaviors had consequences. He replayed conversations in his mind, noticing times he had spoken without listening, laughed without empathy, and assumed connection without nurturing it. The anxiety he felt led to a deep realization. He had not just taken her presence for granted, he had underestimated the depth of what she contributed to his life. This is the unique power of silence. It creates space for reflection that words often disrupt. When someone stops speaking, when the familiar signals pause, the mind can no longer rely on constant reassurance. It begins to probe, to question, to feel the emotional weight of absence. Anxiety on the third day is not about fear alone. It is about awareness. It is the recognition that connection requires presence, care, and attention, and that the absence of these is a powerful teacher. Emotionally, the third day is intense. He may experience restlessness, sleeplessness, or a heightened sensitivity to memory and environment. He notices small things he hadn't before. A text unanswered for a few hours feels heavier. A moment of quiet feels longer. A memory of laughter feels more precious. The nervous system responds to absence with tension because humans are inherently social beings. We rely on connection for emotional stability, and when that connection is unexpectedly paused, the body registers it. Anxiety becomes both a signal and a teacher, highlighting what is meaningful, what is missing, and what must be acknowledged. He may also begin imagining worst-case scenarios, as the mind often does when clarity is absent. Did I lose her? Has she moved on? Did I push her away for good? These imagined realities are uncomfortable, but they are crucial. They force him to confront possibilities he had ignored, to take responsibility for his actions, and to understand the fragility of connection. Anxiety, when paired with reflection, becomes a doorway to realization. The mind, once restless and fearful, begins to clarify the stakes, the impact, and the necessity of change. The third day also brings the recognition of patterns that are often invisible in daily life. He may realize how often he assumed your presence, how often he prioritized convenience over attention, how often he acted without empathy. In this realization, there is a subtle humility, a quiet acknowledgement that relationships are not just about feeling or desire, they're about awareness, care, and consistency. Silence on this day works like a mirror, showing him what he had overlooked and inviting him to grow. Consider the emotional shift that occurs. Anxiety begins as a feeling of unease, a tension in the chest, a restless mind. But by the end of the day, that anxiety starts to carry insight. He starts to understand that your silence is not about punishment. It is about setting a boundary, about valuing yourself, and about demanding awareness and respect. He realizes that connection is reciprocal, that presence must be earned and cherished, and that absence can be a profound teacher. Anxiety and realization together create transformation. The initial unease leads to deep awareness, which in turn leads to the possibility of action. He begins to consider ways to repair, to acknowledge, to show care. Perhaps he plans how to reach out thoughtfully, with respect, without overstepping. Perhaps he recognizes areas where he needs to change, habits he needs to adjust, or behaviors he needs to reflect upon. The third day is pivotal because it is the moment when emotion begins to translate into understanding, when restlessness gives way to clarity, and when reflection becomes the foundation for meaningful growth. Realization on this day often involves recognizing the depth of the relationship, not just its surface moments. He begins to see that connection is not automatic, that attention and empathy are not guaranteed, and that the bond he shares with you is precious precisely because it requires effort, presence, and respect. This awareness often stirs gratitude, humility, and a desire to act differently in the future. Your silence, once perceived as absence, is now understood as guidance, a subtle, powerful signal that demands thoughtfulness and introspection. Even the smallest gestures become significant. He may recall a time when you were patient with him, kind when he was irritable, attentive when he was distracted. These memories, now contrasted with the quiet space you have created, carry new weight. They become lessons, reminders of what he has been given and what he must honor. Anxiety on the third day sharpens perception, while realization deepens understanding. Together, they create a potent mix that cannot be ignored, a mix that demands reflection, responsibility, and a recognition of value. By the end of the third day, he begins to see the patterns of his own behavior more clearly. He understands that connection is fragile, that words and actions carry weight, and that presence is a gift, not an entitlement. Your silence has allowed him to step outside the rhythm of expectation, to feel the emotional weight of absence, and to confront his own patterns with honesty. Anxiety has done its work by highlighting the stakes. Realization has done its work by illuminating the path forward. On this day, change becomes possible. He may start to plan meaningful gestures, consider heartfelt words, or reflect on actions that demonstrate care and awareness. The third day is when internal reflection begins to translate into external intention. The awareness that your absence has sparked is no longer abstract, it is actionable. He begins to understand that relationships require mindfulness, that respect is earned, and that connection is meaningful only when nurtured thoughtfully. The third day of silence is a powerful teacher because it combines emotional intensity with cognitive clarity. Anxiety alerts him to the importance of the connection. Realization teaches him the lessons he may have ignored. Together, they create an environment where growth is not forced, but inevitable. By the end of this day, he understands that your silence is not rejection. It is a reflection of boundaries, self-respect, and clarity. It is a call to awareness, a prompt to observe, and an invitation to rise to a higher standard of care and understanding. By allowing him to feel this anxiety, to reflect deeply, and to arrive at realization, you have given him a gift, not a gift of comfort, not a gift of convenience, but a gift of awareness, insight, and the opportunity to see himself clearly. The third day is a moment of awakening, a quiet, profound emotional shift that reshapes perspective, highlights values, and encourages growth. Through anxiety and realization, he begins to understand the weight of absence, the value of presence, and the transformative power of reflection. By the fourth day of your silence, the subtle anxiety and realization that began on the third day have evolved into a deeper, more complex emotion. It is no longer just about questioning actions or wondering if mistakes were made. It is about longing, an ache that begins quietly and grows steadily, pulling him inward, forcing him to notice what he has truly lost, or at least what he has temporarily misplaced. Longing is a powerful force. It is not about fear, not yet about regret, but about the heart recognizing absence in a way the mind cannot fully articulate. It is the echo of presence in its absence, a quiet signal that some things cannot simply be replaced or ignored. He begins remembering moments that once felt ordinary, moments that now feel extraordinary in their absence. The warmth of your smile in a casual conversation, the comfort of your voice when he was anxious, the laughter you shared over small, insignificant things. These memories begin to carry weight. Humans often fail to appreciate what they have until it is momentarily gone, until they feel the subtle emptiness created by absence. Psychologists call this the phenomenon of contrast awareness, where the absence of a familiar positive stimulus makes the mind more sensitive to its value. Your silence is creating that contrast. It is making him acutely aware of the presence he once took for granted. Longing also brings clarity. He begins to differentiate between what is truly meaningful and what is superficial. Perhaps he notices that the connection he shared with you was more than just convenience or habit. It was care, empathy, attention, and understanding. In the quiet absence, these qualities become vivid, almost tangible. He realizes that your presence was not passive, it was active, contributing to his life in ways he may have overlooked. The absence of your voice, your attention, your energy makes him notice the gaps, and with that notice comes a subtle but powerful appreciation. A real-life illustration can make this clear. A friend once told me about a time when she needed space from her partner after a long period of giving and compromise. She did not speak, she did not engage, but she remained present in the larger sense. Her choices were visible. By the fourth day, he was filled not just with anxiety, but with longing. He remembered her patience when he was irritable, her understanding when he was distracted, her encouragement when he doubted himself. These were not dramatic gestures, they were small, consistent, and meaningful. Yet it was only in her absence that he realized the depth of what he had. Your silence has the power to illuminate value precisely because it removes familiarity and creates perspective. Longing on this day is not passive. He begins to reflect on the ways he may have undervalued the relationship, the ways he may have assumed your presence without acknowledgement. He may begin rehearsing conversations he wishes he had handled differently, gestures he wishes he had made, or words of gratitude he had never spoken. This reflection is not manipulation. It is natural human awareness sparked by absence. It is a quiet form of recognition, a signal that presence is not something to take lightly, that connection requires attention, respect, and appreciation. The emotional intensity of the fourth day is profound. It is a mix of yearning, reflection, and a subtle shift toward humility. He begins to understand that relationships are not merely about what we receive, but about what we recognize, honor, and nurture. Your silence allows him to feel the weight of absence emotionally, to sense the value of your contribution in a way that words, constant communication, or presence alone could never convey. Psychologists have long noted that humans form stronger emotional bonds when they experience temporary separation from loved ones, a process that enhances appreciation and reduces taken for granted assumptions. By this point, longing often leads to a desire for connection, not out of fear, but out of genuine appreciation. He begins to understand that your presence carries depth, that it offers emotional sustenance, comfort, and understanding that cannot be replicated easily. In a way, absence transforms into a teacher, showing him not only what he misses, but why it matters. It is a profound emotional education that cannot be rushed or forced. It must unfold naturally through reflection, awareness, and the subtle power of absence. The fourth day is also a time for gratitude, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of the value of what you bring into his life. Perhaps he recalls moments when you supported him without expectation, when you celebrated his achievements without jealousy, when you comforted him without condition. In your absence, these gestures become luminous, almost sacred. Appreciation arises not because of guilt, not because of fear, but because the mind and heart recognize the richness of what was once familiar and now is temporarily missing. Longing and appreciation together create a profound shift in awareness. He begins to see patterns of neglect or oversight, small moments where he may have failed to notice, to value, or to acknowledge your presence fully. He may recall instances when he took your patience for granted, assumed your understanding as inevitable, or overlooked the effort and care you invested. The quiet absence of the fourth day magnifies these moments, allowing him to experience their significance emotionally and cognitively. At the same time, this longing is transformative. It fosters a sense of empathy, a deeper understanding of the subtleties of your presence and the care you provide. He begins to imagine what it would feel like to truly nurture and honor the connection, not just react to it or assume it. The mind becomes active in reflection, the heart becomes conscious of the emotional texture of your presence, and together they create a profound awareness of value, respect, and relational integrity. Realization during the fourth day is different from the previous day's insight. It is no longer rooted in anxiety or doubt. It is rooted in recognition and emotional clarity. He sees that your presence was not incidental. It was meaningful, intentional, and impactful. He begins to understand that relationships are not merely about being together, but about actively contributing, valuing, and sustaining the connection. Your silence has created a moment of clarity, a pause that allows him to step back, see the bigger picture, and recognize what truly matters. Longing also sharpens memory and reflection. He recalls the details, the way you laughed, the way you listened, the way you noticed things he didn't even mention. He begins to see that these small, consistent gestures are what make presence meaningful. In their absence, their significance is magnified. He feels gratitude, not as a fleeting thought, but as a profound emotional experience that motivates awareness and eventually action. This is why the fourth day is so critical. It is not about manipulation or control. It is about the natural unfolding of human awareness when the familiar is temporarily removed. Absence allows the mind to recognize patterns, the heart to feel the depth of connection, and the soul to appreciate the subtleties of presence. Longing and appreciation are intertwined, creating a quiet but powerful emotional shift that fosters empathy, awareness, and intentionality. By the end of the fourth day, he begins to consider ways to respond, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but out of genuine recognition and gratitude. He begins to plan gestures of care, words of acknowledgement, and acts that demonstrate respect and appreciation. The longing he feels is no longer mere desire. It is informed by insight, reflection, and understanding. He has begun to see what he might have overlooked, to feel what he may have undervalued, and to recognize the effort, patience, and presence that you bring into his life. Longing on this day carries humility. He sees himself in contrast to your absence, noticing where he may have fallen short, and acknowledging the value of what you offer. Appreciation deepens as he considers the emotional, mental, and even practical ways you enrich his life. Your silence has done its work. It has created space for him to feel, reflect, and understand. It has illuminated the significance of presence, the depth of connection, and the necessity of intentionality in relationships. The fourth day is a turning point. The mind, once restless with anxiety and realization, now feels a gentle but persistent pull toward understanding, gratitude, and emotional clarity. Longing and appreciation converge to create a subtle but profound emotional shift. He begins to recognize that the connection he may have assumed was automatic is actually precious, fragile, and deserving of care. He begins to feel respect for the presence he once overlooked and a quiet desire to honor it moving forward. In these hours of reflection, longing becomes insight and appreciation becomes understanding. He sees not only what he misses but why it matters, and in that awareness, a deeper, more meaningful connection begins to emerge. He begins to understand that silence, though uncomfortable, is not emptiness. It is a gift. It is a teacher. It is a lens through which he can see value, presence, and relational integrity with clarity that constant communication cannot provide. By the end of the fourth day, the heart has shifted. Anxiety has softened into longing, doubt has matured into appreciation, and realization has deepened into understanding. He begins to see the relationship not as a series of moments or messages, but as a living, breathing connection that requires awareness, care, and respect. He begins to understand that the depth of your presence is not measured by words alone, but by consistency, attention, and the quiet power of being fully seen and acknowledged. By the fifth day of your silence, a profound shift begins to take place. The confusion of the first day, the doubt and self-reflection of the second, the anxiety and realization of the third, and the longing and appreciation of the fourth all converge into a moment of acceptance. This is not superficial acknowledgement, but deep internalized understanding. He begins to recognize not just the absence, but its meaning, the value it highlights, and the impact it has had on him. Acceptance is the culmination of awareness. It is the point where reflection and emotion meet clarity and resolve. On this day, he begins to confront the reality that relationships are not automatic, that connection is not a given, and that presence carries responsibility. He realizes that your silence is not a form of rejection or manipulation. It is a reflection of your boundaries, your self-respect, and the standards you hold. It forces him to see the truth of the dynamic between you, to acknowledge his own behavior, and to consider what is required to sustain a meaningful, healthy connection. Acceptance comes not as a passive feeling, but as an active choice to face reality with honesty. He begins to ask himself questions in a different way now. Before, they were tinged with doubt, anxiety, and longing, often focused on what he might have done wrong. On the fifth day, the questions are deeper, more introspective. What do I truly value? How have I contributed to this relationship? How can I be more present, more aware, more respectful? These questions are not fleeting thoughts. They are a process of self-examination. He begins to understand that meaningful relationships require growth, intention, and conscious effort. Your silence has created a space for him to think beyond immediate impulses, to consider his actions in a broader context, and to realize that true connection demands accountability. Acceptance on this day is also emotional. He experiences a range of feelings: regret for past oversight, appreciation for what has been present all along, and a desire to act differently moving forward. He begins to feel the weight of missed opportunities, the times he took your patience for granted, and the moments he assumed your understanding without acknowledgement. Yet alongside these feelings comes a powerful sense of clarity. He now sees what is important, what matters, and what is worth preserving. This clarity is the foundation for meaningful change. A real-life example illustrates this beautifully. A man I once knew had grown accustomed to taking his partner's care and presence for granted. She decided to step back, not with anger, but with intention, creating space and silence to allow reflection. By the fifth day, he was no longer anxious in the same way. He was thoughtful, aware, and deeply introspective. He began to notice how often he had assumed her availability, how often he had failed to express gratitude, and how often he had overlooked her emotional labor. Acceptance dawned not as a burden, but as a recognition of truth, and with it came the first stirrings of genuine change. Change, unlike reflection, requires action. On this day, he begins to consider what he can do to honor the connection, to respect boundaries, and to nurture the relationship moving forward. This is where intention meets accountability. He may plan small gestures of acknowledgement, like sincere words of gratitude or acts of thoughtfulness. He may reconsider habits that previously undermined connection, such as impatience, inattentiveness, or assumption. Acceptance without change is incomplete. It is in the conscious decision to act differently that growth occurs. Emotionally, the fifth day carries both humility and empowerment. He realizes that he cannot control your silence, that he cannot force connection, and that meaningful relationships require mutual effort and respect. This recognition is humbling because it strips away assumptions of entitlement. It is also empowering because it allows him to choose his response, to take responsibility for his behavior, and to act with intention. The combination of humility and empowerment creates a fertile ground for personal growth, relational maturity, and emotional integrity. By now, he also begins to see patterns in his past behavior that previously went unnoticed. He recognizes moments when he acted out of convenience, when he prioritized his own comfort over mutual respect, or when he failed to notice the subtle ways you contributed to his life. Acceptance is the lens through which these patterns become visible, and change is the path through which they are addressed. He understands that sustaining a meaningful connection is not about grand gestures alone, but about consistent, conscious attention, empathy, and care. Long-term reflection often begins on this day. He may start imagining future interactions with greater mindfulness, considering how to communicate more clearly, listen more attentively, and respect boundaries more consistently. The fifth day allows him to shift perspective from short-term emotion to long-term relational health. He begins to internalize the lessons your silence has imparted, understanding that connection is nurtured through presence, respect, and deliberate attention. A crucial aspect of this day is emotional ownership. He begins to feel accountable for his actions, not out of guilt, but out of genuine understanding. He recognizes that past behaviors contributed to the distance he now feels, and he understands that future behaviors can either strengthen or weaken the bond. Acceptance is about acknowledging reality. Change is about taking control of what he can influence, his choices, his behavior, and his contribution to the relationship. Your silence, sustained over these 5 days, has become a powerful teacher. It has allowed him to move from confusion to doubt, from doubt to anxiety, from anxiety to longing, and from longing to acceptance. Each stage built upon the last, creating a journey of awareness, reflection, and emotional depth. By the fifth day, he is no longer passive or reactive. He is aware, introspective, and ready to take steps toward meaningful change. The emotional impact of this day is profound. Acceptance brings peace, not because challenges have disappeared, but because clarity has emerged. He understands the stakes, the value of your presence, and the importance of his own actions in maintaining a healthy, respectful, and meaningful connection. With acceptance comes responsibility, and with responsibility comes the possibility of transformation. In practical terms, change may manifest in small but significant ways. He may begin communicating with greater mindfulness, listening more attentively, and responding with empathy. He may acknowledge patterns of behavior that previously undermined connection and make deliberate adjustments. He may prioritize moments of care, thoughtfulness, and attention that strengthen the relationship over time. These are not gestures of obligation. They are expressions of understanding, recognition, and genuine intent. The fifth day is also a moment of emotional alignment. His mind understands the lessons, his heart feels the impact, and his actions begin to follow intention. He begins to see the relationship not as a series of transactions or moments, but as a living, breathing connection that requires attention, care, and consistency. Acceptance and change are intertwined. One illuminates the reality, the other manifests in conscious effort. Together, they create the foundation for a deeper, more meaningful bond. By this point, he has moved beyond superficial reactions. He is no longer anxious in the same way, longing in the same way, or uncertain in the same way. He has processed absence, reflected on behavior, acknowledged value, and internalized lessons. The fifth day allows him to synthesize all previous emotions and insights into a coherent understanding of what matters, why it matters, and how he can act to preserve and honor it. Change on this day is not instantaneous. It begins as intention, supported by reflection and insight. It may take time to manifest fully, but the seed is planted. Your silence has created the conditions for growth, the space for awareness, and the clarity for conscious action. The fifth day represents the moment where insight and emotion meet, where understanding translates into deliberate choice, and where presence and value are fully recognized. Acceptance also brings perspective. He begins to see the relationship in context, not as a series of immediate interactions, but as a shared journey. He understands that meaningful connection requires effort, understanding, and mutual respect. He recognizes that your silence has been a teacher, your absence a guide, and your presence a standard of care, attention, and integrity. This perspective allows him to approach future interactions with intention, thoughtfulness, and respect. By the end of the fifth day, a transformation has occurred. He has moved from confusion to insight, from doubt to reflection, from anxiety to realization, from longing to appreciation, and finally to acceptance and readiness to change. Your silence, subtle yet powerful, has created a space for awareness, responsibility, and emotional growth. He begins to understand that meaningful relationships are not sustained by assumption or habit, but by conscious effort, care, and respect. This day is the culmination of a journey, not the conclusion. It is the moment when reflection becomes insight, emotion becomes understanding, and awareness becomes action. Acceptance and change are not immediate or superficial. They are deeply internalized processes that shape behavior, thought patterns, and emotional engagement. By the fifth day, he has begun to step into a space of genuine responsibility, awareness, and readiness to honor the connection moving forward. Here's a powerful, emotionally resonant conclusion for your keynote speech. Silence is never empty. It carries meaning, it carries weight, and it carries the power to awaken awareness in ways words sometimes cannot. Over these 5 days, confusion became reflection, doubt became realization, anxiety became longing, and longing became appreciation. And finally, acceptance opened the door to true change. Remember, the absence you create is not about punishment. It is about clarity, respect, and the power to show someone, without saying a word, how valuable presence truly is. What you teach through your silence is the strength to honor yourself, and in doing so, to inspire transformation in others. Let that truth guide you not just in relationships, but in every connection you choose to nurture.